Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Depths. Today I'm discussing Strange Contagion by Lee Daniel Kravetz. Lee Daniel Kravetz is a science writer and journalist, and this book is based foundationally around a cluster of suicides that took place in Palo Alto in Silicon Valley, where he was living at the time. He uses the book to try and explore how ideas can catch and spread around a population and how they can influence people's behavior for positive or for negative. It's a really interesting topic that has some very serious connotations for society, and therefore I invite you to join me as I dive into the depths of Social Contagions and into the depths of Strange Contagion by Lee Daniel Kravetz. So, this book came to my attention because I was reading about social contagions more generally, and I wanted to get more acquainted with the research and evidence behind them. I had a cursory knowledge of the topic, but I really wanted to develop it because it's something that has captured me for a while now, because I think it's fascinating how ideas can spread and potentially be influencing us in ways which we are completely unaware of. And I think that having a sophisticated understanding of social contagions leads oneself to question themselves significantly and to view the world and the structure of society very differently. One of the things that the author does very early on is draws on the idea of memetics. He references Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene, where Richard Dawkins first coined the term meme. But one of my criticisms of this book would probably be that he did not delve deeply enough into the terminology of memetics and the concept of memes, but instead used his own terminology. And this is actually one of the things that this book did highlight to me in doing this, though, is the connection between the field of memetics and the field of social contagion, because effectively these are the same concepts by a different name or variations on a concept at least. And I feel foolish for having not made the connection between those two fields earlier, but I also have learnt to revel in that feeling of foolishness, because learning to learn is to repeatedly expose oneself to one's ignorance and to become aware of my own ignorances, although they may make me feel stupid in the moment, is something that I've reframed to recognize as a sign of growth. The death and rebirth process of personal growth is that part of you must be exposed and be willing to die in order that another part can be born and grow. Anyway, so the idea of memetics is it's sort of a metaphor or an analogy to genetics. And I feel that the easiest way to understand memetics is to first have an understanding of genetic evolution. Lots of people have some understanding of what is meant by evolution. They will know terms like survival of the fittest, um, and they will know that there is a relation between one animal and another. So, for example, there's a close relation between us and chimpanzees or bonobos or other primates. But a lot of people don't have a very sophisticated understanding of evolution. And up until very recently, I would have been amongst them. But I would like to think I'm slightly less unsophisticated now. Whether I would go as so far as to say I've got a sophisticated understanding, I feel like that might be too grandiose. But anyway, it's developed quite a lot. And when people think about evolution in their most intuitive sense, from that base level of sort of common knowledge, I guess, to the degree that it's common, people tend to think about reproduction on an organism level. So um, people might joke about propagating their genes, having offspring and passing on their lineage. And that is how it works, but it's not the organism that's spreading out into the future, it's certain genes. So rather than being like humans spreads to more humans, it's like humans spread a variety of genes between them, and certain genes are going to become more prominent in that human population over time based on the ones that die the least. And I say die the least because some people think of survival of the fittest as the alpha, the strongest wins, but that is true to some degree, but it's not that it comes from being the strongest. It's that comes from dying the least, because entropy is the normal state of the universe. So over time, everything tends to disintegrate and cease to exist. So the things that survive the longest or that can replicate themselves the most are the things that survive. And every sort of variation in any species is caused by a slight genetic mutation at some point in the process of repeatedly reproducing. And that slight variation, a significant portion of those are not going to propagate because they have a negative adaptive impact on the organism that hosts them. Um, so most genetic mutations will not replicate, but every so often you'll catch one will catch that endows some additional survival benefit on its host. And if it does, then just by virtue of slightly outcompeting other genes in the gene pool, then over a long enough time span, it will come to dominate. That's as far as I really need to go with genetics to make memetics clear, I think. I'll revisit it if not. But first, I need to explain what a meme is, I think. And a meme, as Richard Dawkins defined it, is a unit of culture. And that's a strange concept because culture is not a material thing that can be broken up into distinct easily measurable units. Instead, by unit of culture, what I interpret is that it's the smallest portion of the complex that is culture. So, an example of this, it's easier to actually do this with subcultures than it is cultures. But that is a culture in and of itself. The question is just scale there. So, an example we might use is punks. So, punk music, what defines a punk, or so someone in the subculture punk? You might say one common feature is they're listening to punk music. That seems like a fairly obvious one. Um, but that music is defined by a certain style, and that style might include low production quality. It would include shouting, or sort of a particular vocal tone that's slightly aggressive and conveys anger for the large part. It might be distorted guitars, fast paced, energetic, but not every example of punk would contain all of these features. But all of these features are contained within the umbrella punk more often than not. And so when you combine all these different features, you get a complex, or what I'm going to call a memeplex. So punk is like a complex of memes, and each individual aspect of it is a meme. You could argue about what level constitutes a meme and what level constitutes a memeplex. You could keep breaking it down and down for a while, but I don't think you need to understand what I'm getting at. Is basically there's a set of ideas and concepts that exist within a certain culture, and when you look for the smallest elements of it, that is the meme, and the culture is a memeplex. Or you get many memeplexes that make up a culture. So you basically got layers of analysis, and we're sort of talking in metaphor because these are not material measurable things, but it's also a metaphor that's very hard to break when you really think about ideas. Because if you reflect on your own capacity to come up with ideas, we all come up with countless ideas about all sorts of things all the time. The vast majority of those we forget within seconds or minutes or hours. And I would wager that it's only a fraction of a percentage that ever make it through a year in terms of all the things that you've ever actually thought of. And so when we think about ideas and concepts in that way, or memes, then we very quickly see a similarity with what I was talking about with genetics. Over time, entropy is the norm and most things die. So, so some ideas survive more than other ideas. And that is basically the field of memetics right there. Is some ideas survive more readily and reproduce themselves more readily than others, and therefore there is an evolutionary process for memes. So then you have to ask the questions of, well, what is it that means that a meme propagates? And by propagates, I mean spreads from one person to another, and even with some mutation, as with the genes. There can be some mutation, there can be some variation, but basically this is a way that a non-living, I guess it's weird. It's weird to consider whether ideas are living or not, because they behave as if they have an independent life from the psychology in which they're hosted, because of their ability to propagate throughout cultures and populations. So there are probably people who have a far greater understanding of exactly how memes spread than me, but there are sort of three key mechanisms that feel most confident in my understanding of. The first is that if an idea or concept relates to a truth that is self evident in the material world. So, if everyone who possesses the meme for gravity, for example, were to die, the meme for gravity would re-emerge regardless, because it is there, and disparate cultures are always going to observe it, and so you can't kill that meme by killing the hosts. The other is that it instills a survival advantage or benefit on the host psychology. And when I'm saying host psychology, I'm referring to the person in possession of the meme. But host psychology, just it makes sense as a term for me, because of what I was pointing out earlier about the way in which memes behave as if they are alive, separate from the people who possess them. So that's why the term host psychology makes more sense to me than speaking about the individuals. Just like the host organism of genes when we're talking about genetic evolution. So, an example that I don't want to tangent too far off into, because I could talk about it for hours. An example of a meme that instills a benefit on the host psychology could be religion. I know there are examples where that is not the case, but we also have to look at the fact that every human population that's ever been identified has had some form of religious practice embedded within its culture. We've never found a society that doesn't have that. And when I was younger, I was far more atheistic before I adopted my current position of religiously confused, as I often refer to myself, tongue in cheek, obviously. Mostly because the term religiously confused amuses me. But anyway, I was atheistic in my younger years as a default, and the one of the big things that changed my thinking on that is developing an understanding of memetics, because I realized that I was throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that I was making an ignorant and ill-informed decision to reject religion out of hand, when clearly religion has a purpose and a function. Otherwise it would not exist at least it wouldn't exist to the same prevalence that it does. And so we can see evidence of this in research that shows that religious people tend to have a higher quality of life higher level of life satisfaction, and they tend to live longer. And there are aspects of that that are poorly understood, and there are many, many questions that are unanswered on that. But it suggests that religious belief instills some sort of benefit on the host psychologies. The third mechanism would be to parasitize the host psychology. So this would be when it doesn't relate to a self-evident truth, which we can consider neutral, although it's important to remember that all evolutionary processes are amoral, so you can't actually make a value judgment from the perspective of the evolutionary process. You can only project your own value judgments onto the process. But we can say that the observance of self-evident facts in the world is neutral. And we can say that instilling a survival benefit or advantage is positive for the host psychology. But when I first came across the idea of parasitic memes, I thought to myself, that's an incredibly arrogant idea, because someone is presuming that they can see an idea has a negative effect on the person who holds that idea, when they don't hold that idea, while this person doesn't see it. So that there's almost it can almost come across as sort of condescending, like, oh, you these people of lesser intellect have enabled themselves to be captured by these ideas that do them no service. That was my first reaction to this concept of a parasitic meme. But as I read more about it, it became more and more compelling. And part of the reason it became more compelling was because I became incredibly aware of just how often I'd fallen prey to ideas that I had absorbed and attempted to act out in the world, and that disadvantaged me in a significant way. I think it's slightly more complicated than that, because the complex interactions of of someone acting out a certain idea mean that it can, in some environments, instill a benefit, and in other environments instill a detrimental effect. But that's a rabbit hole that doesn't need exploring quite at this moment in time. But I've also seen it before countless times, where people have absorbed ideas that they try and act out and that do them a disservice, that end in negative results over and over and over again, and they still cling to them for whatever reason. And again, when you think about the meme as a separate living entity to the host psychology, then that makes more sense. And you can see, so to take an example that might make it more easy to interpret what I'm talking about. So there's a pop culture concept of meme, which are, photographs or short videos that we share on the internet. And there's millions of memes made all the time, and very few of them gain any traction, but some of them do. I'm sure almost everyone listening will be familiar with the Hawk Tour girl, and I'm sure that almost no one can explain to me why that became popular, because I don't understand why it became popular. I found it uh, funny and I appreciated it as a meme, but I don't understand why it became popular, and I also don't understand exactly what it is I appreciated about it. And but the term we use for a meme that spreads like that is it going viral. So there's another analogy there with virus and viral infection. So it's the language that emerges around memes almost implicitly recognizes that they have this independent ecosystem and that they sort of propagate of their own accord rather than belonging to or being necessarily part of any psychology that hosts them. So it basically became very hard to ignore the idea of a parasitic meme. And I've come across it in loads of different places. Richard Dawkins mentioned it in The Selfish Gene. Steve Stewart Williams mentioned it in The Ape That Understood the Universe. Gad Saad wrote The Parasitic Mind, which is almost exclusively about this idea. Andy Norman wrote one that I'm now forgetting the name of. It's something about mental immunity, that was about how to recognize and protect yourself from these viral spreads of memes and ideas. And so it's a very strange concept, but it's one that has to be taken seriously ultimately. And it has to be taken particularly seriously when we consider it in the context of the phenomenon that Lee Daniel Kravetz is illustrating, when it can relate to suicide clusters. And what made this clearly about a social contagion is that they were not just committing suicide through any means whatsoever, they were all committing suicide in an identical manner, and they had no connection with themselves. So it's very different to, say, a suicide cult that make a pact and then all commit suicide, compared to when a localized cluster of suicide emerges using the same mechanism without any obvious connections between the people involved, which is a bizarre thing to try and wrap your head round, and a challenging and emotive thing to try and wrap your head around. You know, the fatality, the fatalism of it. The These are lives that are being not just lost, but many lives around them are being impacted, which adds a sense of urgency to the need to understand it. But it's one of the things the book does very well, although again possibly not as in depth as I would have liked, is that it highlights that these contagious behaviors and ideas can be more than just negative. We tend to focus on the negative, and I've focused on negative to some degree so far, but it can be positive. So generosity can spread in a social contagion like manner. Work ethic can spread in a social contagion like manner. And we all probably, those of us at least who've held multiple different jobs, have seen what happens in a team dynamic when you get one person who is maybe lazier or less motivated or more cantankerous and difficult and obstructive to the process, rather than everyone just sort of getting on and ignoring this person, it tends to bring the overall level of performance down. And then you get one person who's particularly enthusiastic and um, excitable and energetic who comes into the same role, and suddenly everyone's boosted by that. And this was so clearly on display when I worked as a support worker in supported accommodation for teenagers. For a number of years, we had, I believe it was 14 bed spaces in our core unit. So we'd have 14 teenagers in there at any given time. And then we also owned the building next door where we'd have a further three. So 17 all in all in this sort of mini culture internal to the project itself. And everything could be really peaceful, and one person could move in and change the entire dynamic and all of the behaviors of everyone else in that project. So they would still have their own, unique personalities and mannerisms, and you would still have people who are more involved and less involved and all of that stuff. So it's not like it was just pure groupthink, but you could have a really settled and well behaved group of people, and one troublemaker comes in, and suddenly everyone's demonstrating troublesome behavior, or half the population of the building are demonstrating sort of troublesome behaviors. And weirdly, it seemed to be more prominent that that would happen towards the negative than the positive. Positive behaviors didn't spread as easily. Um, I haven't particularly got a hypothesis for that. My best guess would be that it's to do with the developmental stage of adolescents who are testing boundaries and who have not sort of got complete mastery of their own emotions, their own behaviors. And so the excitement of rule breaking and boundary pushing, because there is an element of being an adolescent that inherently entails pushing boundaries, and an important part of that developmental process is pushing boundaries and finding where they are. And so I would guess that there's an element of that being developmentally appropriate, and there just being a lot more appeal and a lot more fun in sort of chaos than there was in order at that point in time. Um, I certainly think that was the case for myself when I was that age. I would be more attracted to misbehavior because it just seemed more fun than being studious and constraining my behavior in all sorts of ways that would involve a higher level of self-discipline than I probably had at the time. And I think that one of the things that's come up most often when I've discussed social contagions of um outside of reading this book, but like in a with people I'm not necessarily so familiar with in different contexts in recent years, the social contagion topic has come up a few times, and people seem to have an instinctive adverse reaction to it. And it's possible that some people like me didn't like the potential for misuse of the parasitic meme idea. But I think it's something more than that. I think it's that there is a meme attached to the word contagion. We have this negative connotation which is transmitted memetically, where when we think of contagion, we think of virus and parasites and illness and sickness and all these things that trigger a disgust response. And interestingly, in The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, he hypothesizes, his sort of theory of the evolution of emotions is that disgust is a branch of it. Basically says that it evolved to help us to avoid contaminants in the environment, so not to eat gone off meat, for example, or things that might make us sick. But also, he hypothesized that the moral dimension of sort of cleanliness and sacredity, sacredity. I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but of the sacred is partially an extension of that disgust mechanism, that disgust emotion. So people seem to react to the concept of social contagion almost with a automatic disgust reaction, which can often have a moral element to it. And I think that that is because they only see they presume, because of this sort of instinctive reaction to the concept of contagion, because we feel a disgust at the idea of contagions naturally, they feel that anyone who describes something as a contagion is attributing a negative value judgment to it, and that it would has potential negative downstream consequences. I mean, there are very prominent examples in history where people have used and who where people have leveraged people's disgust sensitivity to turn them against certain populations of people and to incur negative impacts on the people with whom they've made that attachment. So I understand where that comes from, but I think when you divorce the concept of contagion from this implicit negativity and recognize that positives can be contagious as well, then it enables you to take a more neutral look at the concept of social contagion. One of the most prominent examples in contemporary society, and the one that has most often led to me having these conversations, would be with gender questioning children. The number of gender questioning children has skyrocketed over the last 10 to 15 years, from clinics working with gender related distress witnessing very low numbers below 50 prior to 2012, 2015, and there now being thousands of referrals per year. So it's an unbelievable increase. And people have been trying to explore where that's come from and what's led to it. One of the hypotheses that's put forward is often that society has become more open and there is more acceptance, and therefore more trans people, would be the terminology they would use, have come forward and feel able to share that this is who they are. There are a number of reasons why that hypothesis doesn't work. One of those is the stage of onset. So prior to 20, well, not just the stage of onset, the stage and sex of onset, and the emergence patterns. But so prior to this explosion of this population, there were two distinct demographics that presented at gender clinics. One was adult men wishing to be female, and one was young boys. Females were Biological females were negligibly represented in these populations, and it was very rare for anyone to present during adolescence. Usually, the issues, the distress, had been presenting in early childhood and continued into adolescence, and by and puberty would often be the process through which that was resolved, and they would become comfortable with their own bodies, and the vast majority of them would become comfortable by adulthood and would then go on to live comfortable lives in their biological sex. So, also important to note that a significant portion of those would turn out to be same sex attracted. So, the age of onset begs a question, because you're sort of saying, well, if the new cohort is all emerging in teenage years, it's drastically different from anything that's presented before. So it's not that we couldn't be more accepting of something that didn't exist in that form previously. And one of the other things is that it's almost all female. So that it doesn't inherently disprove the idea that this is something natural and emergent, but when you take it in the context of all the other evidence, it's very hard to maintain that theory, because the next big thing would be detransitioners. So you have an increasingly large population of people who have transitioned, been affirmed, been supported through this process, who are now turning around and saying and going back to living as their biological sex as they mature through adulthood, early adulthood. And the research on their reasons for doing that so far, the vast majority of them say they realized that their issues were nothing to do with gender whatsoever. You then have to look at the emergence patterns. And so we have a cohort of mostly biological females and mostly adolescents, not exclusively, but mostly. And when you look at the emergence pattern from parental reports, which are usually the best way to sort of understand a history of a child, because people are prone to retrofitting their life narratives in their own head to match their current feelings. So when people are depressed, they assume they've always been depressed and will tell a story as if they have been. When people are happy, they will tell stories if they've always been happy. Not exclusively, but so it's not uncommon for children who've expressed no gender related distress in early childhood to, when they start experiencing it, say, oh, this has always been the case. So this is why we rely on parental reports, because parental reports are more, I don't want to use the term objective because there's still an element of subjectivity because parents have a vested interest in their children. But anyway, it's considered the most reliable means of doing this. And once you have it on a large enough scale, you sort of to some degree negate the potential for biases in that, particularly when you sample across different populations that might have different perspectives because of their cultural values. And when you look at the patterns of emergence, there is a very clear pattern with a lot of these teenagers. They've spent a lot of time online prior on forums like Reddit and Tumblr. They have maybe had some social difficulties prior or some experience of trauma. A lot of them have had social care involvement or prior mental health issues. And it clusters, as in people within a friendship, people who are developing this gender related distress are then then in a friendship group where 3 or 4 or 5 of their other friends are coming out with this gender related distress as well. So it's clustered rather than sort of organically emerging in a random pattern as you would expect with more social acceptance. Um, and then then you have to think, well, if it's coming out in clusters, localized clusters within particular social settings, you have to ask the question about, is this a social contagion? And then when you look at the research on social contagion, you find out that adolescent teenage girls are the most vulnerable group to social contagion behaviors. And you find that this has happened with eating disorders, it's happened with self-harm, happened with suicidality, it's happened with a variety of mental health things, it's happened with hysterical laughing, and there's all these different examples, and the vast majority of the examples happen to come out in the same population. It's a gender question thing. So I'm not. This isn't a podcast episode about gender questioning children, although I could do many of those, as it is my main topic of research generally. But I'm using it because it's a clear example of a social contagion. And when it's a morally loaded topic anyway, but when I discuss it with people, they react. People who are particularly supportive of the affirmation model and who would promote the idea that this is just innate to people and emerging due to more social acceptance won't entertain the idea of social contagion a lot of the time. And I think the reason for that is because that they assume that anyone who's describing it as a social contagion is attributing a negative value judgment to anyone who might be experiencing the impacts of a social contagion, which I don't think is true, because you, with the social contagions I've just listed there in terms of eating disorders, mental health, and so on, the suffering and distress that's experienced by the person who has absorbed that meme from the culture is real. Their suffering isn't diminished by the fact that this is socially influenced or peer mediated in any way. Their suffering is still real and still needs to be addressed with them. But it's more a case that we can be so influenced by our environment, particularly our social environment, into absorbing ideas that are causing us harm and distress that we experience as very, very real, because they are real to us in that moment. And then the next thing that I think they're concerned about is that people who are describing it as a social contagion are opening the door for negative treatment of those people, because they're attaching the memetic connotations. I'm just using the word meme and memetic to try and bring that comparison home by repeating it, but these memetic connotations of virus and infection and something that triggers a disgust response from people and that opens the door to negative treatment. And that is not the case at all, or certainly, while I have no doubt that there may be some people who use it dismissively, in those, at least dismissively, to be dismissive of the experiences of the young people affected, the vast majority, in my experience, are using social contagion just to understand where it's come from, and are not dismissive of the pain and suffering that it's caused, and not dismissive of the reality of being a young person in that situation. And this is where this book is very interesting, because it's talking about a social contagion of suicidality. And I believe, if I remember correctly now, that there was 9 people who weren't connected to one another who committed suicide in the story that he was using as the foundation for this book. One thing that I'm probably quite critical of in this book, and it might seem surprising based on everything I've just said, is that through no fault of Kravetz himself, he relied at one point on the idea of psychological priming. And I think, and this makes it sound like people are very easily influenced by very small aspects of their environment. And everything I've said so far is basically to the same effect, that people are very easily influenced by their social environment or their environment more broadly. And that is true. People are very easily influenced by their environment, but there is a lot more that goes into human behavior than just environment. We're not blank slates who are just absorbing everything from around us. We have an innate personality and a genetic composition. We have our own resiliences and vulnerabilities that might make us more or less easily influenced by certain contagions and not others, and certain ideas and not others, and certain influences and not others. But this idea of priming, one of the classic examples I remember reading about for priming was an experiment where they had two different groups who were in a room watching a presentation, and in one of the presentations they flashed up words related to old age, and they recorded and measured the speed of people walking out the room. And the people who were walking out of the room who'd been exposed to words relating to old age supposedly came out of the room at a slower pace. It seems like a very plausible idea, and it sounds credible on its surface, that ideas that surround us would cause us to internalize certain aspects of those behaviors. But this book was published in 2015, I believe, and around that time, the replication crisis, as it's known, was beginning to emerge across the sciences, but prominently in psychology. And around 2015, it became very apparent that none of the priming experiments, more or less, were replicable. And so, if an experiment can't be replicated, it suggests that through any number of random factors, the initial experiments were not reliable in their findings. It could be that their technology is outdated and created errors, which are not, now that we have improved technology, we can correct for, and we find no findings. It might be that just by chance they selected a group of particularly slow people, even when they were using random selection processes to avoid that chance. The There is always still a chance that happens, and this is why experiments that don't replicate don't really hold any weight scientifically. So it was frustrating, really, because I feel like the idea of priming was overly relied on at some points in this book. I don't think it was in any way essential um, to the basic hypotheses and the basic sort of core of the book, because in the book he did recognize that if these primes existed, there's so many of them that we could never determine which ones are playing a part, and it would be unbelievably complex because there's so many different small things in our environment that are influencing us in all these different ways, that it basically is an unrealistic avenue for exploring how to combat social contagions. So by him putting that in, he did protect the rest of his thesis from the impact of having primes negated by their inability to replicate. And like I say, I don't blame him for this, because at the time, if you look at the sort of timelines of the replication crisis hitting the concept of priming, and you look at the time that the book was published, they pretty much coincide, which means he would have been writing and researching for the book prior to prior to this becoming apparent that it wasn't a thing. So you can't sort of point any fingers at him, but it just created a weakness in the book, an unnecessary weakness when looking at it in now, looking at this point in time. There were some very interesting things in there, though, about how to combat social contagions, and one of the more interesting ones that I thought he spoke about was interrupters. So he's talking about this with social contagion of violence, and how violence had sort of broken out in a local community that just happened to be particularly susceptible for a number of reasons. And one of the things that they did was using professionals such as social workers, police, teachers, and so on to recognize the signs of potential violent behavior developing, or someone developing a tendency towards violent behavior, and interrupting that process by intervening, giving them something else to fill their time with, giving them some other sense of purpose, giving them some other structures, and basically just intervening early to reduce the probability of them being drawn into violent behavior. And I haven't looked into this enough since reading the book, and it's something that's going to be an avenue for further exploration for me, because I think that if this concept is as effective as he's reporting in the book, then it could be remarkably useful in helping to reduce the impact of many of the different sort of social contagions that I mentioned, whether it's eating disorders, or whether it's gender related distress, or whether it's self harm. So that is a point that I'm not in a place to really flesh that out any further at this point in time, because it's something that I need to think about. It's more me just making a note of this is an interesting concept that warrants significant consideration and exploration. But yeah, so I think I've probably spoken enough to the contents of the book, and it's what it's getting at, and its strengths and weaknesses from my perspective. It's a fascinating concept, and it's something that I will no doubt be thinking about for years to come and developing my knowledge of, because I think it's really, really important. I do think it radically changes the way you view human behavior. I often question myself as to whether I have absorbed a particular idea or concept from my social environment, and whether this is being reinforced by the people around me. And the best defense I've found for that so far is to adopt an automatically questioning approach to any ideas that are presented to me. I guess I try and approach things as scientifically as I can, by which I mean I ask questions and try and disprove as many hypotheses as I can, and sort of try and stick with what I'm left with. But I also recognize that it would be presumptive and arrogant of me to assume that there weren't a number of ideas that I have absorbed from my environment and culturally and from the influence of others that I haven't even recognized that that's where they come from, but I still base some views and some of my ideas and understandings on that. But I guess this is what Socrates was talking about to some degree when he said that the unexamined life is not worth living. You know, that to me, although I actually don't like that quote because I think that it presumes that many lives it would to me create a spectrum of to how much a life is worth living or not based on how reflective you are and how much time you spend examining your own life. And I think there are many other criteria to what constitutes a good life or a bad life. But I think yeah, I think that what he was getting at is that there's a lot of value in examining your own life. And one of the things that learning about social contagions and memetics has done for me is encourage me to be even more critical and analytical of my own views and beliefs. So I think that we will leave it there. I think it's time to surface, time to get some air and to reflect and, yeah, enjoy what we have found in the depths of Social Contagions and Strange Contagion by Lee Daniel Kravetz. And now a quote from Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The wise only possess ideas. A great part of mankind are possessed by them. Thank you.